The story of Jonah is so common that even those who didn't grow up in the church have likely heard the story about a man who was swallowed by a large fish and managed to live inside for 3 days. And Jonah was swallowed by this fish because he actually asked a group of sailors to throw him overboard out to sea. And he did that because he was running from God. And he was running from God because God had asked him to do a very hard thing, which was to give a message to an evil city named Nineveh, giving them an opportunity to repent and that God would save them. Eventually, after this few days in the whale, the fish spit him out and out onto dry land, and God said, "You need to go." And deciding he didn't want to do that again, he agreed to go to Nineveh. And after a day of proclaiming God's message, the city actually did exactly that. They repented. And that's what we think about when we remember the story of Jonah. We think about the fish, the whale. We think about the 3 days. We think about the running from God. We think about how the city repented. But that's all in chapters 1 through 3. It's actually chapter 4 of Jonah that really is the heart of the message of the book. So I'm going to read from Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. It says, "But to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, 'Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live.'" It's interesting. Jonah mentions these different characteristics of God: gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, and then relenting from sending calamity. But we don't usually think of God as being slow to anger. When we think about the stories of the Old Testament, when we think about those stories, we think about God's wrath. God absolutely does show anger in the Old Testament, but slowly. He gives his people opportunity after opportunity to come back to him. God's anger is not about him. It's about how people were always turning away from him and doing just horrendous things to one another. And he's angry because he loves them and he wants what's best for human flourishing, including the repentance of a very evil city. And Jonah actually calls God gracious and compassionate next. It's a reminder for all of us that we actually do deserve the opposite of that grace and that compassion because of our sin. And instead, God chose to give us grace and compassion. The truth of that grace and compassion is that it's very scandalous. God's forgiveness is very scandalous because it's not fair. And we're used to earning. We're used to trying. And God freely gives when our hearts have turned away from sin and towards him. And next on this list is the phrase abounding in love. And this is actually the Hebrew word hesed, which means simply so much more than the word love. That's why it's translated so many different ways in different translations. Sometimes it's translated loving kindness, sometimes steadfast love or rich in love, even loyal love. It's translated all these different ways because it's so much more than just simply the English word of love, because it's speaking of a word that only a perfect God can give, a love that only a perfect God can give. It's essentially an untranslatable word because that's how profound God's love is for us. And then next, Jonah uses this final phrase, relents from sending calamity. And God does send it, but he doesn't want to. And when he does, it's reluctant. And he often softens it according to what the law of justice demands. He brings warnings, and he brings disciplines to his people, and just to give them the opportunity to come back to him. That's what the prophets were for. And in all of this wonderful talk about God's character, Jonah isn't happy. He says he wants to die because he's not happy when it comes to receiving that kind of love when other people receive it. He's angry that God has relented with Nineveh and not brought about their destruction. After saying all these wonderful things, he wants to die simply because of God's goodness. Jonah wants to die because God has proven himself to be kind and gracious to a people that Jonah doesn't think deserves that kindness. And his anger, his emotion here, tells us a great deal about the state of his heart. It doesn't seem that he has learned anything from his time inside that fish and his subsequent rescue. Jonah seems good with God's grace when it benefits him because he sees himself as worthy, but is resentful that God is merciful to other sinners. He sees their sin as worse than his own. And this prompts a question from God next, where God says, "Is it right for you to be angry?" And God knows the answer to this question, of course. He's trying to get Jonah to think, to step outside of his anger at God and think more critically about what he's actually saying. Does he really want to find himself aligned with the view that God is too gracious? Does he really want to claim that he has found fault with God?